The year is 1943. Picture a young American GI at basic training in the fields of Georgia. He is lying in the prone position, the wooden stock of his M1 Garand pressed firmly against his cheek. His drill sergeant is screaming at him about breath control, sight picture, and the squeeze. His target is a silhouette sitting 500 yards away over 4 football fields in distance. If he hits it, he passes. If he misses, he fails. This was the American doctrine. This was the rifleman's delusion. Going into the Second World War, the United States military was possessed by a singular romantic idea that battles were won by individual marksmen making precise, aimed shots at long distances. It was a philosophy born from the American frontier, hardened in the trenches of World War I, and perfected at competitive shooting ranges like Camp Perry. The logic was simple. If you can see the enemy, you can kill him with one well-placed bullet. To be fair, the Americans had the tool to back up this arrogance. They carried the M1 Garand. It was a technological marvel, described by General George S. The year is 1943. Picture a young American GI at basic training in the fields of Georgia. He is lying in the prone position, the wooden stock of his M1 Garand pressed firmly against his cheek. His drill sergeant is screaming at him about breath control, sight picture, and the squeeze. His target is a silhouette sitting 500 yards away over 4 football fields in distance. If he hits it, he passes. If he misses, he fails. This was the American doctrine. This was the rifleman's delusion. Going into the Second World War, the United States military was possessed by a singular romantic idea that battles were won by individual marksmen making precise, aimed shots at long distances. It was a philosophy born from the American frontier, hardened in the trenches of World War I, and perfected at competitive shooting ranges like Camp Perry. The logic was simple. If you can see the enemy, you can kill him with one well-placed bullet. To be fair, the Americans had the tool to back up this arrogance. They carried the M1 Garand. It was a technological marvel, described by General George S. Patton as the greatest battle implement ever devised. While German soldiers were still cycling the bolts on their Kar 98K rifles, a design dating back to the 19th century, the American GI could fire 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition as fast as he could pull the trigger. On paper, the Americans had the superior firepower. They believed they were invincible. But war is not played on paper. And in the frozen ruins of the Eastern Front, 1,000 miles away, the Germans were learning a bloody lesson that the Americans had not yet faced. The Wehrmacht discovered that modern combat didn't happen at 500 yards. It didn't happen in open fields where you could calmly take aim. It happened in burnt-out cities, dense forests, and confused ambushes. German analysts studied thousands of combat reports and realized a shocking truth. 90% of infantry engagements took place under 300. Deep inside the corridors of the Third Reich, a dangerous game of deception was being played. But this time, the enemy wasn't the Allies. It was Adolf Hitler himself. By 1942, German field reports from the Eastern Front were screaming for help. The soldiers were exhausted. They carried heavy bolt-action Kar 98K rifles that kicked like mules and fired slowly. Against the waves of Soviet submachine gunners, they were being slaughtered. The German engineers knew the solution. They didn't need a bigger gun. They needed a smarter one. They needed a weapon that bridged the gap between the pistol and the rifle. But there was a problem. Adolf Hitler, a veteran of World War I, was obsessed with range. He believed that the German soldier should be able to kill a man at 800 meters. He stubbornly refused to authorize any weapon that used a smaller bullet. He explicitly issued a times Führerbefehl times a direct order banning the development of any new caliber ammunition. He argued it would strain the logistics of the Reich. The engineers at the Haenel Company, led by the brilliant Hugo Schmeisser, decided to commit what was essentially treason. They ignored the order. They developed a revolutionary new cartridge, the 7.92x33mm. Curse, short. It was a strange-looking bullet short, stubby, and seemingly underpowered. But it was a masterpiece of physics. It had less recoil than a rifle round, allowing for controllable automatic fire, but far more range and power than a pistol bullet. It was the Goldilocks round just right. To build the gun that fired it, the army generals had to lie to Hitler's face. They hid the project under the boring designation **MP43*** Maschinenpistole 43. They knew Hitler liked submachine guns, so they pretended this was just an upgrade to the existing MP40. Under this cloak of secrecy, thousands of these prototypes were manufactured and smuggled to the Eastern Front. They were given to the elite 5th SS Panzer Division Viking for a live combat trial. The results were terrifyingly effective. In the frozen hellscape of Russia, a small group of Germans armed with MP-43 seconds found themselves surrounded by Soviet forces. Instead of being overrun, they unleashed a storm of continuous, accurate fire that decimated the attackers. They didn't just survive, they dominated. The secret couldn't be kept forever. In a frantic conference in 1943, Hitler asked his generals what they needed to hold the line in the East. A battle-hardened general stepped forward and famously replied, "Mein Führer, we need more of these new rifles." Hitler was confused. What new rifles? When the deception was revealed, Hitler flew into a rage. He had been disobeyed. But then, he looked at the after-action reports. He saw the kill counts. He realized that his generals had built a weapon that could change the tide of the war. His anger turned to excitement. He picked up the weapon. It looked futuristic, made of stamped sheet metal rather than polished wood. It looked like a machine. Hitler realized the boring name MP-43 didn't do it justice. It needed a name that would strike fear into the hearts of the Allies. He looked at the weapon and christened it the Times Sturmgewehr *, the storm rifle. The concept of the assault rifle was born. The secret was out, and soon American GIs in France would be hearing a sound they had never heard before, a rapid, heavy thumping that signaled the arrival of the future of warfare. The hate didn't start with the politics or the propaganda. It started with the noise. Late 1944. The Ardennes forest. The trees were frozen, stripping away the cover that the American GIs desperately needed. A patrol from the 28th Infantry Division was moving through the mist, their boots crunching on the hard snow. They were seasoned veterans. They knew the rhythm of the German army. They knew that a German squad relied on the MG-42 machine gun. If you could knock out the machine gun, the riflemen with their slow, bolt-action Kar 98S were easy pickings. You just waited for them to work the bolt, and in that split second of silence, you fired. But on this day, the silence never came. Contact was made at 40 yards, a terrifyingly close distance in the dense woods. The Americans instinctively dropped to the prone position, bringing their M1 Garands up. They expected the sharp times, crack times of the German rifles or the terrifying times, rip times of the MG-42. Instead, they heard something new. It was a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical chugging, asterisk, thump, 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 asterisk. It wasn't just coming from one position. It was coming from everywhere. The American squad leader tried to suppress the enemy, shouting for his bar gunner to open fire. But the barman was already pinned, dirt kicking up into his face every time he tried to lift his head. The Germans weren't conserving ammo. They weren't taking careful, aimed shots like they were taught in basic training. They were unleashing a wall of lead. This was the Sturmgewehr shock. For the GI hugging the frozen mud, the math was horrifyingly simple. His M1 Garand held 8 rounds. He could fire them fast, but then he heard the ping and had to reload. The German across the clearing was armed with an STG-44. He had 30 rounds in a magazine, and he could switch between accurate single shots and devastating automatic fire instantly. One German teenager with an STG-44 could output more firepower than 3 American riflemen combined. The hate came from the feeling of helplessness. The American doctrine of one shot, one kill crumbled when the air was so thick with bullets that you couldn't even look up to acquire a target. The GIs realized that in the dense forests and the ruined streets of Aachen, accuracy didn't matter. Volume mattered, and the enemy had the volume. They hated the STG-44 because it broke the rules. It felt unfair. It pinned them down, isolated them, and terrified them. It forced them to call in artillery or tank support for what should have been a simple infantry skirmish. When the firefight finally ended, usually after the Americans overwhelmed the position with sheer numbers or mortar fire, the GIs would walk up to the dead Germans. They would look at the strange, stamped metal guns lying in the snow. They looked cheap. They looked like toys. But the survivors looked at those toys with a mixture of disgust and envy, knowing that this ugly piece of metal had almost wiped them out. They hated it because they knew, deep down, it was better than what they were holding. By the winter of 1944, a strange and dangerous economy had emerged on the Western Front. For years, the ultimate war trophy for an American GI had been a Luger pistol, a souvenir to take home to show off to the folks in Ohio or New York. But as the fighting grew bitter in the German borderlands, the desire for souvenirs was replaced by a desperate lust for survival. The most coveted prize was no longer a pistol. It was the Sturmgewehr 44. To understand why American soldiers were willing to risk court-martial to carry an enemy weapon, you have to look at what they were holding in their own hands. The M1 carbine was light and handy, but in the freezing cold of the Battle of the Bulge, reports were flooding in that its small bullet was bouncing off heavy German winter coats. It lacked stopping power. A GI would pump 3 or 4 rounds into a charging enemy, and the man would keep coming. Then, they looked at the dead German at their feet. Lying in the snow was a weapon that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. It was stamped from ugly, rough metal, but it held a curved magazine with 30 rounds of ammunition. For the frontline soldier, the math was seductive. The M1 Garand held 8 shots. The STG-44 held 30. In a close quarters ambush, that difference wasn't just a number. It was the difference between going home and going to the morgue. Photos from late in the war tell the story. If you look closely at pictures of American units pushing into Germany, you will often see the lead scout, the man in the most danger, carrying a German assault rifle. They called it a battlefield pickup. It wasn't authorized, it wasn't regulation, but it was lethal. However, this lust for firepower came with a deadly catch. The sound of the battlefield is a language. Every soldier learns to speak it. You know, the slow times, thud, thud, thud times of the American .50 caliber. You know, the terrifying times, rip times of the German MG-42. And by 1945, every American knew the distinctive rapid-fire times, crack times of the STG-44. This created a terrifying dilemma for the GIs who captured them. If you opened fire with a German weapon during a chaotic night battle, you sounded exactly like the enemy. There are tragic accounts of American soldiers being cut down by their own friends because the sound of their stolen prize drew friendly fire. Sergeants would often threaten their own men, warning them that if they fired that kraut gun near the squad, they'd be shot by their own side. There was also the issue of hunger, not for food, but for brass. You couldn't walk up to a US supply truck and ask for a box of 7.92 Kurz ammo. To keep the gun fed, you had to become a scavenger. American soldiers would recklessly crawl out to dead German positions, patting down corpses, not for intelligence or money, but for those curved magazines. It was a humiliating reality for US ordnance officers. The greatest industrial power on earth, the United States, was winning the war, yet its soldiers were throwing away their own rifles to grab the stamped metal weapons of a collapsing empire. They knew, even if their superiors didn't admit it, that the enemy had built the future. And until the war ended, they wanted to hold a piece of that future in their hands. May 1945. The smoke over Europe was finally clearing. The Third Reich had collapsed, and the victors were scavenging the carcass of the German war machine. In the United States, crates of captured STG-44 seconds arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The Ordnance Department, the men responsible for arming the American soldier, unpacked these strange, futuristic rifles and laid them on the table. They took them apart, they fired them, and then they made a decision that would cost thousands of American lives 2 decades later. They laughed at it. To the American experts, the STG-44 was an embarrassment. It was made of stamped sheet metal, welded together like a cheap toy. It fired a weak cartridge that dropped like a stone after 400 yards. They called it clunky, ugly, and poorly made. In their arrogance, they dismissed the assault rifle concept entirely. They doubled down on the past, developing the M14, a heavy, wooden, long-range battle rifle that was essentially just an updated M1 Garand. They convinced themselves that the next war would be fought by marksmen at 800 yards. But in the ruins of the East, the Soviet Union was looking at the exact same German weapon. They didn't laugh. They took notes. The Soviets had been on the receiving end of the Sturmgewehr. They knew exactly what a wall of lead felt like. They didn't care about polished wood or 800-yard accuracy. They saw the STG-44 for what it really was: the future of infantry combat. While the Americans were polishing their heavy rifles, a young Soviet tank mechanic named Mikhail Kalashnikov was finalizing a design that would change the world. He didn't copy the internal mechanism of the STG-44 directly, but he stole its soul. He took the concept of the intermediate cartridge, the high-capacity magazine, and the doctrine of overwhelming volume of fire. The result was the AK-47. It was the spiritual son of the German STG-44. The price of American arrogance was paid 20 years later in the humid jungles of Vietnam. In 1965, the first major American combat units deployed to Vietnam carrying the heavy M14. They walked into the elephant grass and found themselves facing the North Vietnamese army. And just like in 1944, the nightmare repeated itself. The American soldiers found that their long-range rifles were uncontrollable in full auto and too heavy to swing quickly in the dense jungle. Meanwhile, the enemy was armed with AK-47 seconds. The communist troops could unleash a storm of automatic fire that pinned the Americans down instantly. It was a tragic irony. The US military had rejected the German design in 1945, only to be slaughtered by its Russian clone in 1965. Desperate, the US scrambled to field their own assault rifle, the M16, rushing it into service with disastrous reliability issues. But the lesson had already been written in blood. The Germans had invented the solution to modern warfare. The Soviets had stolen it, and the Americans, blinded by tradition and pride, had ignored it until they had no choice but to learn the hard way. The STG-44 didn't save the Nazis, but its legacy ensured that the American rifleman's delusion was finally put to rest.